Hear words of insight in the Annunciation by Alla Renee Bosarth. The artist had broken canon law forbidding anything holy to extend beyond the borders. When the angel's wings stretched effortlessly past the borders of the picture, beyond the icon's frame, into the world freely, and the woman listening smiled. She smiled openly, shamelessly, fearlessly. And women, seeing her smile, smile back, and suddenly discover they are incapable of submitting any longer to soul-killing control, and feel something within them stretching, wanting to laugh out loud in the dead still church, wanting to dance, lift their skirts, and see what is being born from within them in that moment. What holy wonder is coming forth from inside their tired old caved-in hearts. Then it will be the second coming of creation, and Christ will live again in every woman's resurrection. For words of insight in and truth in contemporary expression, thanks be to God.
Listen for words of faith in the Gospel of Luke. Within a few days, Mary set out and hurried to the hill country to a town of Judah, where she entered Zechariah's house and greeted Elizabeth. As soon as Elizabeth heard Mary's greeting, the child leapt in her womb, and Elizabeth was filled with the Holy Spirit. In a loud voice she exclaimed, "Blessed are you among women, and blessed is the fruit of your womb. But why am I so favoured that the mother of the Messiah should come to me? The moment your greeting reached my ears, the child in my womb leapt for joy. Blessed is she who believed that what our God said to her would be accomplished." Mary said, "My soul proclaims your greatness, O God, and my spirit rejoices in you, my Saviour. For you have looked with favour upon your lowly servant, and from this day forward all generations will call me blessed. For you, the Almighty, have done great things for me, and holy is your name. Your mercy reaches me from age to age for those who fear you. You have shown strength with your arm. You have scattered the proud in their conceit. You have deposed the mighty from their thrones and raised the lowly to high places. You have filled the hungry with good things, while you have sent the rich away empty. You have come to the aid of Israel, your servant, mindful of your mercy." For words of divine revelation, thanks be to God.
May I speak in the name of the God of Mary and her child Jesus. Christmas time is so often a meeting place, isn't it, of loss and gain. So many of us find that good and hard memories are tangled up. My parents died a year ago this weekend, and just as a new child was conceived in my immediate family, a child will therefore be a new gift among us this Christmas. But it's hardly the first time, is it, that death and birthing have been entwined. Reflecting on that helps me better understand today's gospel, and not least Mary's extraordinary cry of justice and of joy. As Alla Renee Bosarth brilliantly expresses it in her poem Annunciation, this is a cry of subversive angelic power. So no wonder the three large angels that will be displayed in here shortly, that we will welcome from Lismore's Lighten Up project, are entitled Courage, Compassion, and Joy. Because as Lismore's wonderful community artist Gilly Jackson has identified, Courage, compassion, and joy are core life-giving elements, not only for Queer Pride, that we will partly celebrate next year, but they also vitally flow out of, or I'd say fly out of, the Gospel and the Magnificat of Mary. And as Gilly suggests to us, these are the core of what the way of Jesus is and what she sees in this particular community. I used to think of my parents as joy and justice, the latter of which is pretty much courage and compassion entwined. Because justice and joy, like my parents, are indeed intimately entwined, and it was so fitting that they died within hours of one another. A deep concern for justice was planted in me by my father, and I recall one hugely formative moment, doesn't reflect well on me, in my life when I was a small child. My sister and I were taken on a shopping trip in our little rural town and became quite argumentative, not for the first time. At one point, and not to my credit, I pushed her in frustration, and she typically made a meal of it. Then, to try and stop her over-the-top screaming, she had a point, but I tried to give her threepence, 3 pence, which was actually quite a lot of money in those days, especially for us little kids. My father was absolutely furious, not so much about this typically sibling rivalry spat, but about what I'd done. "You must never, ever," he said, "pay off anyone for their pain or frustration, ever." Those words are still seared in my soul because they come out of my father's own deep experience of family struggles, not least appalling rural and working class poverty, and the influence of his sisters, my aunts. Because the full expression of pain and the recognition of it and justice are non-negotiables for genuine human, never mind Christian behaviour. Anything else is grace and reconciliation without cost, which is not really grace at all. Now, of course, my father, for all his proto-feminist chivalry, did have some things to learn about justice himself, as we all do. He took a little while, for instance, to catch up with the rest of my family with issues like the ordination of women. And he probably also surprised his younger self by his amazing, heartfelt affirmation of his transgender child when they came out. Now, I guess my mother was an ideal balance in that, not that my father was short of playful creativity and joyfulness himself. In his later years, he literally let out his clowning persona. My mother, however, was the well of our deepest family joy. Indeed, joy could have been her middle name. Among the beautiful things she nurtured was a treasure house of books of spiritual delight and joy. And she loved particular posters, including one which above all reflected her life. It was a famous saying of St. Francis de Sales, "Bloom where you are planted." Bloom where you are planted. Now, I used to struggle with that saying because much as I feel deeply for the people and places I've known, I know that I'm somewhat of an itinerant. So my favourite prayer is the pilgrim prayer of Brendan the Navigator, not least perhaps because the Celtic blood in me always longs for the soil and the sustenance which gave me birth. But in some respect, transitioning of various kinds has repeatedly been a core part of my life and calling. And I know I'm not alone in that, because most of us on this continent and in our changing capitalist world have made and or have to make transitions. Spiritually speaking, many of our lives involve how to give those changes meaning, becoming pilgrims and not just passengers, still less jetsam, on the way. Now, of course, bloom where you are planted can be used conservatively, keeping people in their place, so to speak. But it's actually far more radical. It certainly did not mean for my mother simply being content with her lot, without, for example, struggling for greater life and justice. Rather, as we see in Mary in our gospel reading today, and in her child Jesus, it meant living into and out of justice and joy wherever we are and whatever we face. Now, in my mother's case, she spent decades afflicted with terrible rheumatoid arthritis, for which she tried every suggested cure under the sun, an affliction which left her joints, fingers and feet permanently distorted. 11 years ago, she then had a major stroke, which left her bedbound and incapacitated down one side of her body, and which gradually wasted her away. But throughout all that, she knew and lived joy. Because through her faith, she knew that deep truth, the Advent, Christmas truth, expressed by the poet-priest Geoffrey Stoddart Kennedy, talking about the appalling miseries of the First World War, the abiding truth that peace does not mean the end of all our striving, joy does not mean the drying of our tears. Peace is the power that comes to souls arriving up to the light where God himself appears. That's the heart of our gospel reading today. And in my opinion, that's the heart of the Bible. And it's the heart of Mary's extraordinary song. And it's a continuing vital message for us and our times. I don't know how many of us, I know some of you have carried a lot of things of late, griefs and losses, some of them long-lasting, and some of them also anticipatory, but also quite real. You know, fears, for example, of pain to come, of loss that's going to happen, and death itself. It's a deep communal reality too, isn't it? I was at a recent secular conference of women in leadership, and we were talking about many things, including the horrendous domestic and sexual violence that our courts seem to be struggling with still. I found no one disagreed when I suggested that we were all suffering trauma too as a society, on top of the hideous trauma some of us bear. Collective trauma like the pandemic, climate change, the ravages of late capitalist economics, and the collapse of faith in traditional institutions, including in many places belief not only in religion but democracy and international solidarity and peacemaking. Now, whatever some Christian preachers say, sadly in a way, the gospel does not have any simple answers to these traumas. But like faith for my arthritic mother and my father in his background of poverty, it does offer pathways to live through them, blooming where we are planted right now among them. And that's what Mary proclaims in her Magnificat. Now, who exactly was Mary, and what kinds of challenge and trauma did she face? We don't know, but scholars and spiritual writers today continue to ask telling questions. Was she, for example, maybe the survivor of rape and or other abuse? Maybe perpetrated by a Roman soldier. I mean, it was very common in those days. Or by someone powerful in Judean society. Does the virgin birth controversy in that way cover it up? Certainly, grouped as she is with the other women named in Jesus' family tree, she was almost certainly someone like those foremothers who were sexually or racially dubious in some way. They are startling examples of that. And they're linked together, and you have to ask, if we've got these ones, what are they saying about Mary? Because Mary obviously had some issues that people struggle to cope with. My sense is that she was certainly probably not so much Judean blue blood as a woman with Samaritan or Syro-Phoenician or other minority ethnic blood, which would explain for me how Jesus was particularly strong in his expression of solidarity with such groups. Today, we might see her as an indigenous woman of the land. So, coupled with the deeply uncertain biological complications of Jesus' conception, which we'll never be able to answer, Mary can be seen to represent those at the worst end of many evils: racism, sexism, social, economic, and cultural oppressions, and quite likely sexual and other abuse and trauma. In Luke's understanding, too, she had a powerful anticipatory awareness of the likely forthcoming trials her child would face and the suffering she would bear with him in that journey of faith. But, and this is the mystery and magic of faith, instead of being crushed or deferential to her fate and all those powers that oppressed, she not only gave birth to her child in such lowly circumstances, but she does so with incredible strength. Truly, the queer angels of courage, compassion, and joy are powerfully manifest in Mary, whatever Christian tradition has tried to do to make her just a subservient woman. For Mary, bloom where you are planted did not certainly mean put up with your lot. No wonder her child, Jesus, didn't behave like that either. Rather, it means give birth, and you don't have to be a woman to do that, but give birth to God, to courage, to compassion, justice, joy. Or as one of our Advent carols has it, give birth to your angel potential, right where you are, wherever you are, whatever you face. Like all of us, Mary couldn't go back to wherever she may have come from in the past. Or unlike those who are more privileged, she couldn't just move to another more comfortable space. She simply had to have faith and journey through that space and those circumstances she found herself in, empowered by the justice and joy that comes from our deepest being and from the examples of those others who live out of it and into it. So to take up the imagery of Alain René Bozarth's poem Annunciation, Mary, as it were, broke the canon laws of how she was supposed to live. She saw the angel's wings, as Allah says, calling her beyond the frame. And she began to lift her own skirts to dance and sing new life, resurrection for herself and others. Instead of living just in someone else's frame and under their law, she began to paint her own picture. And she became an icon of revolutionary love for those who can see it. Literally, and in other ways, she had faith to give birth to the divine presence and power within her. Now, Alain René Bozarth in that poem is explicit about how such transformative effect, such angelic response and prophetic action has on others. It's an encouragement to us to act similarly. Because when anyone gives birth to this power of justice and joy, the power of the divine, especially a person on the margins, then others start to dance and smile and begin to give birth themselves, especially the marginalized and traumatized who see themselves in those who've stepped outside the frame, empowered by that release of courage, compassion, and joy. And that, by the way, is part of Alain René Bozarth's story, as one of the famous Philadelphia 11, who were episcopally ordained in 1974 beyond the then frame of patriarchal canon law, disturbing it, changing the Anglican Communion and the wider church and world forever. Because in her, as with Mary and my parents in their way, divine angelic faith was not simply affirmed, but it was embodied and it was lived. And that's our challenge. It's an uncomfortable one, isn't it? An uncomfortable call to step out beyond the frame and to trust those wings of the angels. The challenge of courage, compassion, justice, and joy. Will we go where angels fear to tread? Will we ignore the siren calls to mere comfort and respectability, or despair and cynicism, and instead attend, like Mary, to the deepest promptings of our soul? Will we follow the angel's wings and step outside the frame? Will we lift up our literal and metaphorical skirts and dance justice and joy in the world? Will we seek and become kaleidoscopic icons of justice and joy, not only speaking about God and singing about God, but giving birth to divine love itself? Now, what giving birth to divine love means takes many forms, some of them yet to be unveiled in us. That's the exciting thing about faith, because we don't know what's going to happen next. So it requires our attention, why Advent is so important, prayer and mutual support. And we'll express that differently, just as the Song of Mary, the Magnificat, can be sung in different ways. So today we're going to end with a traditional heritage hymn. Next week we'll have a contemporary non-binary canticle version of it. But however you sing this song, we're all united by the angel's call to justice and to joy. And in all our diversity of sharing, as we become with Mary what the ancient church called Theotokoi, God-bearers. A final note for today. Receiving angels. It comes at a cost, doesn't it? And I don't mean we have to pay for the lanterns. I mean the real stuff, Mary, that we've been talking about. As we see with Mary and with Jesus, the two lights of Christmas and of Easter are linked, death and life. As we see in the Bible and experience in many different ways, there often has to be a death if there is to be life through new birth. And we need to bear that in mind as we seek to move forward as individuals and as a community, because whilst we may honour our past, as I've done a bit today, our good memories as well as our griefs and losses, we have to be open to the future. And that's what Mary does. Open to the future, to hear the voice, the angelic voice, is calling us into being something more than we are, for ourselves and for others. Because it's from the future and from the deepest parts of ourselves that new light comes forth. In the name of the one who creates, liberates, and dances us into new life. Amen.